It was a war of firsts. America's first undeclared war. The first true jet war. The first direct combat between American and communist troops. The first time American POWs were brainwashed. The first war fought when the United States and Russia were both armed with nuclear weapons. It was not Vietnam. It was Korea. There is one thing that Korea shares with all the wars waged before or since. It was fought by young men whose lives would never be the same again. In the next hour, you will meet just a few of the nearly 2 million Americans who served in the Korean War. This is their story.
The experience that moves me so much when I recall the Korean War is to remember the women and the children and the babies. And their only access to safety was the sea. And my captain chose to take every last one of them off that beach.
The MiG was on the inside of me and fired. And he opened that little old F-86 up like a tin can.
My saddest moment in Korea was at the cemetery in Metzel. I had a chance to really see for myself what this effort was costing. I looked at those crosses and thought to myself, next week I'll be at one of them.
From the men whose stories have gone untold for 35 years, to the young soldiers whose stories are just beginning. From the traditions of centuries to the leaders of tomorrow. From a land of war to the games of peace. Between the triumph of World War II and the trauma of Vietnam, there was another war. It was one of the bloodiest in our history, but somehow we've forgotten the men and women who fought and bled and died here in Korea. I'm at a place called Panmunjom, and this 17-inch cement line is all that divides Korea. Standing here, I'm in South Korea. A few steps to the north, I would be in communist North Korea. Although an armistice was signed 35 years ago, we are still neither at war nor peace with the North Koreans. What we have here is the longest truce in modern military history. On the eve of the 1988 Olympics, as the lengthy, intense ceasefire continues, it's difficult to remember the beginning of this war. It was 1950, just 5 years after the end of World War II. At home in America, we were settling down to enjoy our newfound prosperity. We were tired of war and death, a nation understandably reluctant to send our sons to another battlefield in a distant land most of us had never even heard of. Korea is called the land of the morning calm, but early on the morning of June 25th, 1950, that calm was violently shattered. The North Korean army stunned the South with an all-out offensive, and the capital city of Seoul fell in just 4 days. The North seemed well on its way to uniting all of Korea under communism. On June 30th, President Harry Truman ordered U.S. ground troops to help defend South Korea. But the momentum of the North Koreans was simply too great, and our combined armies were pushed back to the southeastern corner of Korea with our backs to the sea. If ever there was a time to call in the Marines, this was it. 23-year-old Lieutenant Frank Metzel of Springfield, Missouri, was ready for action.
If we were going to get into a fight, I wanted to be among the first to get into it. I got over that feeling in a hurry. But at that point, we were like a highly trained boxer ready to come out of the ring, waiting for the bell. Marines had triggered the first UN counteroffensive of the war. We're all firing on the ridgeline to our front where our other two platoons were assaulting. 4 rounds of 82 millimeter mortar fire came in. 1 round landed in the pit of the back of a young man about 10 or 15 yards from me. I saw the impact, I saw the explosion, and saw his body literally shredded in front of me. It looked like something out of a meat market. This had been a human being. A Marine, an American boy, 17, 18 years old. That was when I got my real introduction to what war is like. The enemy staged a counterattack late that afternoon with 4 tanks and infantry. I threw what grenades I had. I fired off what I could fire. And then I was hit in the head with a piece of a grenade fragment and knocked unconscious.
Frank's men thought he was dead, and in the heat of battle had to leave him behind. When Metzel came to, he had no idea where his company was, so he took off, running in what he hoped was the right direction, and landed right in his own command post, where the Marines were still pinned down.
The company commander very wisely called an airstrike in on the top of the hill. Corsair dropped a 500-pounder right smack on the crest of the hill, quieted them down for a few moments, and we up on our feet and we took the top of the hill.
Although the United States led the costly international effort to stop the North Korean aggression, it was uniquely a war of the United Nations, fought by 16 UN countries. Through a sheer fluke of history, the Russians were boycotting the Security Council when this landmark resolution to intervene was passed. Otherwise, the Soviets, aligned with the North Koreans, most certainly would have vetoed it. There was no North and South Korea until the end of World War II. Before that, it was one nation, and for most of the 20th century, all of Korea had been ruled by Japan. But after the Japanese surrender, Korea was split at the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union would control north of the line, while the United States occupied the south. Like an invisible Berlin Wall, the 38th parallel separated families as well as a nation. Still, for the people of South Korea, liberation from the tyranny of the Japanese was like a miracle. In the fall of 1950, the enemy was no longer the Japanese, and the time had come for another miracle.
This is a memorial to one of the greatest military miracles of this or any other war. This is Inchon. After 2 months of fighting, our troops were still trapped in the Pusan perimeter. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, knew the situation was desperate and called for bold, dramatic action. He devised a seemingly impossible plan for an amphibious landing deep behind enemy lines here at Inchon. The tides of this harbor are among the most dangerous and extreme in the world. The water would be high enough to allow landing craft onto the beach for only 5 days during the fall of 1950. And even then, some 19,000 Marines would have just a few hours to get ashore in enemy territory before the tides receded and the coast became an impassable sea of mud once more. Even General MacArthur gave the operation only a 1 in 5,000 chance of success.
It was the most improbable thing that had ever been concocted. If you could land a strong force at Inchon, cut that 25 miles into Seoul, you'd have the rails and the roads strictly under control. There would be nothing they could do in the south. The only option they had would be to abandon everything and to straggle back as individuals through the mountains with no roads, no trains, no anything.
After less than 6 weeks in combat, Frank Metzel had been wounded twice and earned the Silver Star for his heroism. He then found himself on a Navy ship heading into the perilous Inchon operation.
I thought there might be a chance that, I'm going to be in the rear with the gear this time. There's lots of troops, maybe somebody else will take the landing. But instead, the skipper told me that I would take the first wave over the seawall. I thought, this is it. If you survive, this would be nothing less than a miracle.
Before the troops could attempt a landing, the United States Navy bombarded the coastline to minimize enemy resistance. Then the Marines took over.
When the flag dropped, we went. All 4 of us, followed by 4 more, followed by 4 more, followed by 4 more. We all hit the seawall at approximately the same time, around 5:31. I was out of the boat almost immediately. I turned to one of the guys in the rear of the boat and yelled at him, "Throw me a grenade." He pitched one up like a baseball. I caught it in midair, pulled the pin, and threw it. Bingo, out came 4 men. A little battered and bloodied, but they were alive. We had 4 prisoners, and we're on the edge of the seawall. I took off, running as fast as we could run. We headed for Seoul, up the Seoul-Inchon highway. It was apparent. This war is won. We have cut the main supply lines. Seoul is like a plum waiting to be picked off. We've won this thing. It was a wonderful sensation.
The joy of victory was short-lived for Frank Metzel. Just a few miles outside of Seoul, the young lieutenant was hit by enemy fire.
What happened was I lost a fist-sized piece of meat out of the calf of my leg, with the main artery pumping blood out on the ground. Corpsman came on the run and reached into his bag of tricks and dove into that hole with his dirty, filthy hands and that set of forceps, and reached down and located that pumping artery and clamped a forcep on there, or I never would have made it out the field. He was a good man. After 5 or 6 days of attempting to save my leg, the surgical team came back, sat me up in bed, and unwrapped the bandages on my leg, and I knew before they did it, and of course so did they, that the leg was beyond hope. I had gangrene, you could smell it. But they made me look at it so I would never have any second doubts about what we were going to do. And of course I knew the leg had to go. It was a somber, down in the mouth, horrible experience.
Although the war was over for Frank Metzel, thousands of soldiers and Marines continued the fight. In a matter of days, they had recaptured Seoul, the enemy was on the run, and everyone thought we had won this war. Everyone was wrong. After the overwhelming success of Inchon and the recapture of Seoul, our troops headed north of the 38th parallel towards the Yalu River and the Chinese border. In what was perhaps the single greatest miscalculation of this war, Macarthur did not believe the Chinese would help their North Korean neighbors. He was confident that victory was at hand. Like most Americans who fought in Korea, 19-year-old Ed Reeves of Joliet, Illinois, was a private in the Army. But as he fought his way through the icy mountains of North Korea, he already knew what General Macarthur was just about to discover. Reeves knew that the Chinese communists, or as he called them, the Chi-Coms, had already entered the war in great numbers. What neither Macarthur nor Reeves knew was that absolute disaster was about to strike at a frozen hill called the Chosin Reservoir.
The night of 27th is when they were shooting all around us. They were already on the ridge. I think they were in place before we moved up and dug in. And then from there on, it was just hanging on by our fingernails till morning. Everybody talks about the cold that was there because you tried to find anything to find relief from the cold. Cold actually hurt you more than the wounds when you were wounded. It was like somebody hitting you. It was so hard, you ached from it. Morning of the 28th, an officer called to me. I took 2 steps toward him, and the enemy dropped a large mortar shell right behind my heels, and I flew. As I flew through the air, I heard somebody scream, and I yelled, "Shut up," because we had a pact with each other. If you're wounded, you keep quiet, because noise lets the enemy know they're on target and they'll pour it on. So you keep quiet if you're wounded. But somebody was yelling, and then I realized it was me as I flew through the air, and I shut up and killed the other men around me, but I was so close I just had bad leg wounds. But it was so cold that immediately your blood would start freezing in your clothing, and it would stop up the holes and hold the blood in you. So the cold actually was saving me.
14,000 exhausted American troops were outnumbered and completely surrounded by 120,000 fresh Chinese forces. Ed Reeves and the other wounded who could no longer walk or carry a gun were loaded into trucks. There was no choice but to attempt a retreat.
Well, we are under constant fire. So when a driver would be killed, the man riding shotgun with an M1 next to him would move over, and they'd get the truck moving, and we'd go down the road, leaving the driver's body behind. The roads were constant lumps of GI bodies. In some places, there were so many GIs being killed that even in that weather, the guys that were still wounded fighting beside the road were walking through red slush. It was constant moving till finally our truck was so shot up, it stopped about 200-300 yards behind the last truck of the convoy. And the order was, if you could still walk, drag someone in a sleeping bag behind you through the snow to cross the ice. So they left, taking everyone they could with them. We had no weapons left, but we were still getting fired on. The Chi-Coms were coming to the truck, and we had nothing to hold them back. And at that time, I noticed there was smoke in the air. So I called to the driver and asked about the fire. He said the enemy are burning the trucks. And we said, where are they taking the wounded? What's the shooting and yelling we hear? He said, if they try to climb out of the fire, they shoot them. So then I knew I was going to have to burn alive. And at 35 below zero, you can sweat. I really started sweating.
Ed's truck was out of gas and would not burn, so the Chinese began shooting the wounded.
I watched them die right up the row. When the man next to me was shot, his head recoiled into the air and back down. And then I watched. I was still with my head turned toward him. It was silly because part of the man had been blown into my open mouth, and I was ready to spit, and I thought, this is ridiculous. You're worried about his blood and tissue. You're going to spit when you're dying next. Why spit? But then I was busy watching the rifle barrel come around and the man's sight on me. Watched him in his trigger squeeze and said, Jesus, here I come. And the shot knocked me flat. But I wasn't dead, so I opened my eyes, looked back at the man and waited for his second trigger squeeze, but he didn't shoot. He just looked back at me, climbed down from the truck, and I could hear the crunch of the snow as they walked away. And when it was quiet on the road and I couldn't hear enemy moving, I'd try to whisper to them, hey, Doc, Joe, Mac, can anybody hear me? But one by one they quit breathing, and I was all alone in the back of the truck.
Having survived with no food for over a week, with shattered legs, with severe frostbite, and with broken bones, Private Reeves crawled for 24 hours, inching his way across 3.5 miles of ice before being rescued by the Marines. In desperate need of immediate medical attention, Ed was flown by helicopter to a Mobile Army surgical hospital, a MASH unit, for treatment.
It was finally good to wake up and see some doctors, somebody working on you and taking the pieces out and sewing you back together again. It meant that you were back in civilization, being taken care of.
This is Uijeongbu, the temporary home of one of 7 MASH units that operated during the Korean War. Most of the MASH personnel were drafted and surprised to find themselves in a place like this. But under what can only be described as difficult circumstances, they saved nearly 98% of the wounded young bodies that came through their makeshift hospitals.
There was no fancy equipment or even surgical tables in the tents which served as operating rooms. Litters were placed directly on sawhorses and draped with whatever clean linen was available. When Ed Reeves arrived at the 8076 MASH unit, the doctors could not believe this man was still breathing. Yet somehow he was alive. This was news he desperately wanted to share with his mother, but his hands could not hold a pen.
Dear Mom, this letter is being written by a buddy. The reason this temporary letter is to let you know that I'm all right and not to worry. It seems that they've decided to give me a little rest at long last. It seems that I got a little bit of frostbite in my hands. They're treating me fine, and I'll be using my hands again before I realized I ever even had them frostbitten. Love, Ed.
Private Reeves was shipped back to the States for treatment. He lost all of his fingers and both legs below the knees. But with his mother's faith and Ed's determination, he was eventually able to leave the hospital.
Well, actually, I was home on my first medical leave for a Armed Forces Day parade. And I got one nice note from a senior in high school. This girl just wanted to thank me for what she believed I'd done for my country. And I said, this girl I would like to meet. So my older brother said, we'll just get all of the phone books from the area, and we'll call everybody by the name of Hall and ask if Beverly's home. We found 2 men that were named Beverly Hall that were irate. They hadn't written me a letter. But finally, I got a hold of her father. When she came home from work at the ice cream shop she was working in, I talked to her, and I talked her into a date, and that was in May.
4 months later, Ed and Beverly got married. They have 7 children. 2 are orphans that they adopted. Korean orphans. As Christmas approached in 1950, it was the season of both hope and despair. It was a wonder that anyone survived the savage battle at the Chosin Reservoir, but those who did gallantly fought their way towards the sea. As one general put it, retreat hell, we're just fighting in another direction. All in all, over 100,000 withdrawing military personnel were joined by 98,000 fleeing North Korean refugees. Everyone filled the beaches, hoping that somehow they could be evacuated. It had happened before at Dunkirk in World War II, and it would happen again in Saigon. But this was Hungnam, Korea, and the odds were against a rescue. A 23-year-old New Yorker named Bob Lunny was a staff officer aboard a merchant marine ship off the coast of Korea. His ship, the Meredith Victory, was carrying an explosive cargo of jet fuel when they sailed for Hungnam.
We received emergency orders to proceed north. All available shipping was needed because the enemy forces, the Chinese communists, had moved in more rapidly than expected. At Hungnam, we were met in the outer harbor by minesweepers. The minefield, the Wonsan Hungnam minefield, was considered to be one of the heaviest laid minefields in the history of naval warfare. And we were told that the field had been swept, a narrow channel existed through the minefield, and we were ordered to proceed behind one of the sweepers. The Navy inquired as to what we were carrying, and when we signaled back that we were carrying the 10,000 tons of jet fuel, even the sweepers got farther and farther and farther away from us.
When Bob Lunny's ship reached Hungnam, the port city was surrounded by enemy troops.
The civilian population had been threatened with annihilation by the communist forces. We were the last ship capable of taking out any of the people on the beach. We proceeded because Captain LaRue, without question, said that he would volunteer to take his ship in and would load every person that could fit on the ship. It took us almost 36 to 48 hours to load almost 14,000 of these civilians on board, and consider that we were a freighter. We had no passenger accommodations. We loaded these people like freight.
Just moments after everyone was safely aboard the overburdened ship, the city of Hungnam exploded. Navy engineers detonated miles of explosives while Navy guns bombarded the coastline. The Chinese would find nothing of use to them now. For the people on the Meredith Victory, the only threat now lay ahead of them. The ship, still carrying a load of jet fuel drums, attempted to re-navigate the heavily mined harbor.
Strikingly, the most dramatic incident I recall was being asked by the captain to go down below because in the middle of winter, we found a number of the civilians were building fires atop these drums to keep warm and to heat food. And it was with great trepidation and without trying to startle the civilians. And keep in mind, we spoke no Korean in an attempt to get them to put the fires out.
After 3 long days at sea, the weary travelers arrived at Busan. It was Christmas Eve, but there was no room for the refugees and they were turned away. On Christmas Day, the ship reached Kojido Island and safely delivered its precious cargo, which included 5 babies born en route. Despite the lack of food, space, and water, not one life was lost during the dangerous voyage. As a result of the valor of Bob Lunny and his shipmates, 14,000 Koreans and their descendants live in freedom. For these people, this was the Christmas miracle. Despite the humanitarian victory of the Hungnam evacuation, the winter of 1950-51 was a military disaster. And for General Douglas MacArthur, it was the beginning of the end. After our troops were so devastatingly turned back at the Yalu River, the general became more convinced than ever that we had to conquer Asian communism. He openly advocated the use of atomic weapons and publicly criticized the Truman administration's policy of fighting a limited war. For President Truman, MacArthur's attacks were a challenge to the presidency itself and a threat to civilian control of the military. On April 11th, 1951, Harry Truman delivered the stunning news.
It is with the deepest personal regret that I found myself compelled to take this action. General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders. But the cause of world peace is much more important than any individual.
MacArthur returned home for the first time in 14 years, and in a truly unprecedented gesture, the United States Congress invited the rebellious general to address a joint session.
That old soldiers never die. They just fade away. And like the old soldier of that battle, I now close my military career and just fade away.
But MacArthur did not fade away. Whatever mixed feelings the nation had about Korea, America welcomed him back with open arms. In New York City, 6 million people crowded the parade route, more than had met either Lindbergh or Eisenhower. Many people believe that Harry Truman avoided World War III by dismissing Douglas MacArthur. Others thought we avoided victory. But even without the legendary general, the war would go on, and new heroes would be born on the battlefields and in the skies of Korea. Truce talks would begin, but peace was still a distant dream.
We came to Korea in June 1950 and planned on being home for Christmas, but this was not to be. The so-called police action soon became a conflict, and finally, we all admitted, an undeclared war. Battles at places called Bloody Ridge, Pork Chop Hill, and Heartbreak Ridge claimed thousands of young lives as peace talks here at Panmunjom dragged on. It is perhaps the greatest tragedy of this war that 375,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured while the peace negotiations stalled for 15 months over a single issue, the exchange of prisoners. The Chinese and North Koreans demanded that all their prisoners be returned unconditionally, while the United Nations Command insisted that repatriation should be voluntary. Meanwhile, soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen fought on, not knowing if they would become the next casualty or the next prisoner of war to be used as a bargaining chip at the peace table.
Lieutenant Vern Wright was only 21 years old and a fighter pilot in the world's first jet-powered war. The skies of Korea were ruled by American pilots and the mighty F-86 Sabre jet. Although outnumbered 5-1 by the Russian-supplied MiGs, we maintained undisputed superiority of the air. U.S. pilots won 9 out of every 10 dogfights. Still, under any circumstances, a MiG could be deadly.
Tiger lead, Tiger 2 here. I got a couple of bogeys out there. One coming around at 2 level. All right, I'm going in now.
Vern Wright was shot down twice in less than 24 hours and managed to avoid capture both times. The young Texan seemed to be one lucky flyer when his luck finally ran out.
On the day that I was shot down for the third time, we saw a flight of about 4 to 6 MiGs attacking 2 F-86s. So we decided to join in. And we rolled in on the MiG that was behind the F-86s. I flew right into a stream of fire. And he opened that little old F-86 up like a tin can. And it happened so quickly. I came to, actually, tumbling in the air. We were at 35,000 feet. After tumbling and tumbling, I was about 3,000 to 5,000 feet, I guess, when I pulled the ripcord. And as I floated down, I saw people coming out of a village toward me. I hit the ground and looked around, and I could see the Koreans coming. And I started the other way. And I was going toward a hill, and just like in the movies, American movies, here came the Chinese over the top of the hill. And the Chinese were the ones that got to me first. I don't believe the Koreans would have allowed me to live if they'd have gotten to me first, because their village was destroyed. I can see where their animosity was. 4 days after I was shot down, we arrived at Pyongyang. The only training that we were given for conduct if you're captured was a briefing, and the briefing was to tell them anything that they can get out of a newspaper. And one thing they told us, tell them that your mother is sick or your father's a drunk or whatever is a good idea, because it'll play on their emotions and they won't be so hard on you. This was the feeling that our intelligence had, but they were wrong, I think. And one afternoon, I was walking with one of the interrogators, and he said, "Did you know the Americans are using germ warfare?" And I said, "No, not a chance." He says, "Of course they are. They're dropping germ-infected ants and animals and in North Korea to try to kill Koreans and Chinese." And I said, "No, that's not the way they would do it at all." He says, "Oh, then how would they do it?" And being kind of mouthy, I said, "Well, they certainly wouldn't use animals. They'd probably spray it or something like that." "Oh, you know about this." Well, I never got back to the schoolhouse, and that was in April, and that started 8 months of interrogation because they wanted a confession.
The germ bombs were loaded 15 minutes before our mission, while ordinarily our aircraft were loaded 2 hours or more before a mission.
A handful of American pilots did succumb to Chinese pressure and made false germ warfare confessions. The Korean War was the first time that POWs were used as weapons of propaganda, and the film statements were shocking.
When my son asked me what I did in Korea, how can I tell him that I came over here and dropped germ bombs on people, destroying and bringing death and destruction?
As a result of the treatment of our prisoners, a code of conduct would later be issued, telling servicemen what was expected of them if they were captured. But in Korea, each man was on his own. Vern Wright's captors were determined to obtain a confession from him, but even when they brought in a fifth interrogator, this American was just as determined to resist.
Well, he started working on me, and I went back and I told him that my father was a drunk and my mother was sick, and et cetera, et cetera. And over a period of several weeks, he reversed all this, and he was telling me, he convinced me that my mother was sick and my father wasn't alcoholic and drunk, and that if I didn't confess, that I'd never see him again. Well, over and over, it became a part of me, and I started believing my own lie. And finally, one day he was interrogating me, and he took me to the point that I actually broke down and started crying. And he patted me on the shoulder and said, "That's good. That's what I wanted to see. Now you relax and I'll be back later." And he left. The door opened and the big Chinese guard shamed me. He says, "Boo, boo, poo-how." And it dawned on me then that what had happened. And I regained my composure, and that did more for me than anything, for this young Chinese soldier to shame me. And at that time, I just went through a change. And I was determined not to let him take advantage of me again. It must have snapped me back to reality.
Lieutenant Wright endured physical and psychological torture, disease, and months of solitary confinement, but he never made a false confession to germ warfare. As Verne continued his lonely fight against the Chinese, he was painfully unaware that the Korean War was about to end. Peace was finally at hand. During the 2 years of on-again, off-again negotiations, some 18 million words had been exchanged and hundreds of thousands of lives lost on both sides. But when the armistice was finally signed on July 27, 1953, there was still a line separating North and South Korea, a line that military might and individual sacrifice had moved only 10 miles. It was the first time that the United States had fought a war without victory. For the men on the line, it was good enough just to be going home. No one could believe that at 2200 hours, this war would simply stop. But at exactly 10 p.m., an unfamiliar quiet, followed by signal rockets, confirmed every man's silent prayer. We were going home. During the Korean War, over 7,000 Americans were captured. Nearly 40% died while in captivity. For most of the POWs who did survive, men like Verne Wright, words like home, America, and freedom took on a whole new meaning.
As we were released from the holding camp, we were put in trucks and driven south to Panmunjom. The feeling was one of immense exhilaration, a tremendous exhilaration, because we were going to be free. The sun was shining. I remember that very, very well, and it was a beautiful day. It would have been a beautiful day if it had been raining. We got out of the trucks and there was a whole group of people. It was just great being able to walk around and not have somebody standing around with a gun behind you. Well, in San Francisco, it was great. We were all singing "California, Here I Come," and it was really great walking down the gangplank. The ship was met by a band, and so we had a little fanfare there, certainly because prisoners of war were a celebrity type. But for the most part, the Korean veteran was forgotten.
This is the bridge of no return. After the war, thousands of soldiers made the decision of a lifetime here. Both sides agreed that the prisoners of war who wanted to go back to their homelands could cross safely, but they must never cross back into the land of their former captors. For most American POWs, this was not a very difficult decision. Today, anyone who wishes to cross from South to North Korea can still go. However, anyone trying to leave North Korea will be shot by the North Korean guards.
Many people don't realize that the Korean War never really ended, and that American troops are here enforcing the longest ceasefire in modern military memory. Although both sides continue to talk almost every day, there is an ever-present tension along the narrow line that divides this country. After visiting the border between North and South Korea, one must have a strong appreciation for the soldiers who face a hostile enemy every day.
What do you miss the most?
If you have strong family ties at home, that's when it's the worst, because every day I'm counting the days and missing Mom and my brothers.
It could be as bizarre as a 7-Eleven or as close to the heart as your family.
It's a very different feeling from being back home. You know, being back home is the best thing.
How about a picture? Look how close I am.
The mission for which we are charged to do here is very, very important, and we do it very, very well most often.
This part of the American sector of the DMZ is surrounded on 3 sides by North Korea. And although North Korea is a small country, they maintain the 6th largest army in the world. And behind those hills, less than a mile from here, 65% of that army is standing on alert, poised for war.
The men here at JSA are the finest soldiers in the United States Army. They know exactly what they're here for, and we can train them to do exactly what we need them to do here. And as you've seen throughout Korea, these soldiers know exactly what has to be done, and they're willing to do at all costs what has to be done to keep this place in freedom.
Vietnam for over 10 years and lost 58,000 men. The Korean War lasted 3 years and claimed 54,000 American lives. Clearly, our sacrifice in the Korean War was enormous. Mothers from 19 nations sent their sons to fight and die here. 35 years after this war ended, there remains one very important question. Was it worth it? Unlike Vietnam, this war did hold the line. To the north, across the Bridge of No Return, lies one of the most backward and repressed countries in all of Asia. To the south lies one of the Orient's most powerful, prospering nations. Although it has, admittedly, a flawed democracy, South Korea still enjoys a margin of freedom. But once again, in the end, was it worth it?
I think it was worth giving up 20 months of my life to help the nation have freedom, and I would do it again.
There's no question in my mind that Korea was worth fighting for, because although it was a distant land, it preserved a corner of democracy and freedom at another place in this world. And as long as we preserve those places in the world, our freedom is more ensured.
And if I had to do it over again, I would do it. Because I believe if we don't stand for the freedoms we have, we won't have them.
There's never been any question in my mind that Harry Truman did the right thing, that the lines were drawn. It's the same old question, if not now, when? If not us, who?
In 1950, we arrived in Korea to fight a war. In 1988, we returned for the Games of Peace. This is the home of the 24th Olympiad. For anyone who fought in the Korean War, this must be the most dramatic symbol of how far this country has come. Now, a generation of Koreans with no memory of war looks to its future. And the veterans who have so many still vivid memories of war have gone on with their lives. Frank Metzel, the Marine who lost a leg after the Inchon landing, is married and a financial analyst for the Catholic Archdiocese in Springfield, Missouri. Ed Reeves, the soldier who survived both the Chinese and the cold of the Chosin Reservoir, is a Christian missionary who lectures all over the world about his war experiences. Bob Lunny, the merchant marine who helped rescue thousands of Korean refugees, is now a captain in the United States Naval Reserve and an attorney in New York City. And Vern Wright, the jet fighter pilot who was a POW for a year and a half, went on to fly 155 missions in Vietnam. 2 of Vern's 4 children graduated from the Air Force Academy and are also pilots. After retiring from the Air Force as a colonel, Vern now lives in Sarasota, Florida, and is still flying.
Flying as a fighter pilot was very exhilarating. flying an air ambulance is very sobering, because now I'm carrying a life and I'm trying to save a life. It's a completely different concept.
Hotel accommodations